Released in 2007, this movie, directed by David Fincher, comes with a stacked cast, including Robert Downey Jr., Jake Gyllenhaal, Mark Ruffalo, Anthony Edwards, and so many more. This film revolutionized the use of digital filming, much to the chagrin of Downey and Gyllenhaal, due to the insane amount of takes Fincher would require. And while it may not have been nominated for any major awards, it still sits with an 89% on Rotten Tomatoes and continues to be lauded as being one of the most historically accurate portrayals of the still yet unsolved Zodiac murders. On today's episode of You've Never Seen It, we're talking Zodiac. Welcome to You've Never Seen It, an audio podcast where I am on a mission to never hear these four words again. I am your host, Allison Salamone, and joining me today is Screen Junkies, Rotten Tomatoes, and some more news writer, as well as host for audio podcast Binge Boys alongside Hal Rudnick and Garmin Shozia. I hope I said that right. Over on Content Candy. Lon Harris. Hi, Lon.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Thanks so much for coming. I just want you to know that was the first time I went through a whole intro and did not have to stop and redo it. So I'm really proud of myself right now.
Well done. I was gonna say you've got a really good podcast voice. You know, like when you start doing the show, you go into that very like it's like that hosting. Like I could tell the moment the podcast starts versus your regular voice. You got that like.
I fake professionalism really, really well.
Yeah, no, it was good.
That's what we try to do over here. Well, welcome. I'm so excited to have you. I'm really excited to talk about this movie with you. We're talking Zodiac directed by David Fincher. Yeah. Has one of the most stacked casts I think I've seen so far with all the movies that I've done. And I mean, as a basic bitch, I admit to it. The whole
Your
idea.
words, not mine. I would never.
This is like this whole 2 hour and 42 minute true crime film really tugged at my heartstrings in that sense of like, it's literally, I listen to every single true crime podcast that there is. So to see a movie that literally hit all those notes for me too was just awesome.
Well, this is kind of, in some ways, I feel like this is the ultimate, like, true crime movie because you always get they always feel like they have to do, it's from the perspective of the cop or it's from the perspective of the victim or, they pick a person in the story and then they're like, here's who we're following and we're going to follow their personal story. And this one kind of is like, no, we're going to follow the case. And then we'll watch all these people as they kind of come in and out. But it's really not about any of them. It's really it's almost like reading the case file. And sometimes you'll jump ahead and be like 4 years later, and we're just going to catch up with all these people's lives because that's not what the movie's about. It's about this investigation. That's the main character.
And they don't beat around the bush. Like when the investigation stops and it stalls, it flashes forwards another 4 years when something comes back up or something else. And I really love that. But before we dive too deep into it, I just kind of want to know, before even talking about Zodiac itself, movies in general, what got you into them? Give me your history.
I don't know where it came from because neither of my parents are big movie. Like they'll watch, but they don't hate movies. My dad likes Bond films and my mom, like rom-coms or whatever. But, there was no, it wasn't like I grew up in a household and I was immersed in it and there was like a deep love for movies. Like they were TV people and could kind of take it or leave it. My mom definitely was a bigger reader. I just always loved them from my time I was a little kid. And then I have a younger brother named Jonathan and I got him into them. So by the time I was like 7 or 8, Jonathan and I were immersed in a world of movies and my parents were kind of like, all right, well, I had sort of hoped they would be into science or sports or cars or something, but all right, they're going to do movies. That's the thing. So I have no good explanation for where it came from or why that was the thing I latched onto from an early age, but it always kind of stuck with me. And, I studied, I tried to be a screenwriter for years and it was during my sort of post-college years. I had originally thought I wanted to work in the film industry, like be, a manager or an agent or do marketing or publicity. And I sort of studied that, and I did a couple of those jobs, and I hated it right away. And I started working at a video store and trying to write scripts instead. And it was during that period that I really got into not just liking movies, but I'm going to learn everything I can, and I'm going to watch everything I can going back years and years into old stuff. And that was really when I became like a big nerd about it, was during those years.
Very cool. And then what was it about Zodiac and I guess David Fincher that made you want to talk about this movie with me?
Oh, well, I mean, I think this may be my favorite David Fincher movie, and I just think it's fascinating. I just think there really aren't other movies like this in this way, and I think that especially the way that we were talking about, how it's so focused on the investigation rather than the characters, while having this sort of lively cast, but then thematically, it's so much about that too. And it doesn't have any answers. I mean, I think that's one of the things I like is. It's both. It doesn't have any answers about the case. Like, it has a theory that it advances. Like, maybe Zodiac was this guy, Arthur Lee Allen.
Right.
But it's not definitive. They're still like, well, but there's these three things don't make sense, and there's no proof. But it also doesn't let you off the hook in terms of the personalities, in terms of what it's even really about and what it's really saying. I love the way that it's very specific, but it's also got this really heavy ambiguity to everything. And it's like, well, whose obsession is justified and whose obsession is not justified? Or is all of their obsession not justified? And I think that's really fascinating too, how you can really dig into the movie and get lost in it just in the same way that the characters do. And by the end, it's like, up is down. You're not sure who was right or who was justified, or whether this all has been a waste of time.
Yeah. One of the things that I took when I was coming in to watch this movie, because obviously knowing about the Zodiac and the history and that it's still unsolved, it was one of the big questions that I had was, how is he going to wrap this up? Like, where are we going to end it? Because a cold case. It's run cold. Before this movie was released, San Francisco had, and in the end, like, cards that they're going through, it says that San Francisco had closed the case as unsolved, but the other towns and cities had it still open. And then turns out after this movie was released, San Francisco reopened it because of this movie.
And every few years you'll still see, this person now thinks their uncle was Zodiac. And that was a big thing right after the movie came out. Just like with JFK. You're probably too young to remember this. But after JFK came out, I don't really think the point of JFK, the movie, is here's what happened. It's like, here's what it looked like from the perspective of this one guy, Garrison, and like his investigation. And in the same way, I don't think this movie is like lives or dies based on whether you believe Arthur Lee Allen was really the Zodiac, as Robert Graysmith came to. But it was anyway. For like 6 months afterwards, there were all these articles like, "Oh, here's what Zodiac gets wrong about the case," and it's like,
well, of course, it's a movie. We got to dramatize some things.
and yeah, I mean, I think to be looking at it as the definitive, like, here's who the Zodiac is, like, totally misses the point. It's about how you have to live in a world where you never get to know, and why these guys in particular needed to know. Like, what was it about Paul Avery and David Toschi and Robert Graysmith that drove them to this point where they couldn't live in a world where this one guy, even though, and a few other characters point this out several times during the movie, that, a lot of people get away with murder, even just in the Bay Area every day. But this crime sticks in these guys' craw. And I think that it's so, you never get a clear and definitive answer. The movie's about that. It's about, we're in a world where nothing has a real answer.
And I also really liked with this movie, doing my research on it after watching it and everything, that it's David Fincher was I think he was very smart, and I appreciate that he did it, that the only scenes where you saw people getting murdered were individuals that were part of the Zodiac's killing spree, but had someone that survived. So that way he was keeping it as accurate to what truly happened, to be respectful for these families. And I just thought that was really cool.
And also the police blotter aspect that, well, these are the crimes that the investigators have that level of insight on because there's a person who was there who said, here's what happened in order. These other crimes were coming in and we're left to kind of wonder, we don't know what happened in that cab other than the guy got shot from behind. And so that's what we see. But we don't see what was the conversation in the car because nobody who survived was there except the Zodiac. And yeah, I mean, that's what David Fincher, I mean, it's that discipline and that rigidity and that here's how we're going to do it. And I'm going to follow that through the entire 2 hour and 40-minute movie. And I'm going to get it exactly right and never stray from that. You only see things that we objectively would know. There's a lot of great stories about him being just like an exacting taskmaster on this movie too.
Yeah, I think I read that Robert Downey Jr. was also getting really, really upset with him throughout this filming because it was one of the first big movies to do everything straight to filming all on digital. So you could do 72 takes of one scene because it didn't matter and it was digital. Right. And Robert Downey Jr., I think Jake Gyllenhaal too, were having a really tough time with how hard he was writing them.
But even just like the exacting, I mean, there's a story, and I don't know if this was true. I was not on the set, but there's a story that in that San Francisco Chronicle newsroom set that they built out that's in a bunch of the movie. If you went into any of those desk drawers and opened them, there were period appropriate, like they had 70 staplers in there and nothing on that set, even inside the desk was like not from the period. And that's just like David Fincher's mind, like it has to just be period correct and exactly right. But I mean, I think that when you see it, the movie captures this level of reality that is beyond what other filmmakers really get, I think. And it does feel lived in and 70s appropriate and accurate in a way that is uncanny and that I think other movies don't really necessarily get to.
Oh, for sure. Again, with Fincher, with all the close-ups that he also does when you're talking when you have Mark Ruffalo and Jake Gyllenhaal or Mark Ruffalo and Anthony Edwards, I feel like it would make sense to make sure that he followed all those little minute details because of how I don't think delicate's the right word, but just with how really, I mean, it comes back to being historically accurate. I also love the little tidbit of information I learned that he thought Jake Gyllenhaal's hands were too soft and dainty. So whenever there was a close-up of him doing his cartoon illustrations, it's CGI. he put hair on his hands and knuckles because he thought. So once I learned that as I was watching the movie, anytime I saw Jake Gyllenhaal's hands on a phone, it made me laugh.
It's that. But I mean, like, I feel like that in some weird way is like that's how he connected to this material, is like that fetishizing of detail and that everything has to be exact. Like that's what these guys are doing with this case. They're just rereading it and looking over these notes over and over until they find the one little thing that, that doesn't make sense. That's a new wrinkle. And that's how this investigation goes. And I think that's such a fascinating sort of that duality. And also just the way that the movie is, kind of divides itself between these three characters. Downey Jr. is Paul Avery, the journalist, Gyllenhaal as Robert Graysmith, the cartoonist, and then Mark Ruffalo as the cop, David Toschi. And, it's like their approaches are all very different and without putting a fine point on it. Like there's no scene where they have a conversation about like, well, I'm just doing this because it's my job. I don't know why you're doing it. I mean, like it comes up, but it's not, it's really, there's a very light touch to it. And I think you really get to think about it for yourself, like what each of these guys' angle is on this and like what it's doing for them personally.
Oh, for sure. And then with Robert Downey Jr., because I think this came out the same year, but before Iron Man.
I feel like it was Iron Man was first, but by a matter of months. This was like October in 2007.
Yeah.
So Iron Man, I think, would have been like the summer of 2000. Oh no, Iron Man is 2008.
Okay.
So this was October 2007. And then Iron Man would have been like the next spring.
Right. So now we're marking the comeback of Robert Downey Jr. I think a lot of, and I feel like, I mean, I had seen Iron Man, so that was my foray back into Robert Downey Jr. But now I wish I had seen this movie as well. But back then I was just a really super casual movie watcher. I saw what was in theaters and what I felt like seeing. And would never have known any history of what RDJ had done and how this was such an
Right.
important big comeback for him.
And it's an interesting role in that it like he came back and did a few of these roles that kind of nodded to his persona and what people knew about him, and playing an addict and playing somebody who was sort of like fallen on hard times. And so that was being able to sort of channel that in a movie was one of those signals that, oh, okay, he's back and he's reflecting on this journey he's been on. And then of course Iron Man really solidified that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Do you find yourself with people, if say someone's like, hey, I want to start watching David Fincher movies, like, do you find yourself recommending this movie in general, or even just in a general basis, a lot to people?
I mean, I do feel like this is a movie that comes up a lot just because a lot of people have not seen, I think, the length, and I think that the idea that, I don't know, I feel like the idea came up somewhere that Seven is like the fun, accessible David Fincher serial killer movie, and this is the brainy, cerebral one. And so I think people gravitate more towards Seven, and Seven's great. I don't mean to knock Seven.
No, Seven's, yeah, Seven I recently watched, I want to say in the last year and a half. And I mean, even with, the problematic Kevin Spacey of it all, it still is a phenomenal movie. My David Fincher film repertoire it's growing. So like I've done Gone Girl, I've done Fight Club, Seven, and then just recently I also did The Game with Michael Douglas, which that's a fun one.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're always good. Like he's so confident. He's a great stylist. He works with great cinematographers and actors. I really feel like there's kind of two David Fincher modes. He does these he's so good at like conventional kind of thrillers and crime movies and movies that just kind of hit that. They're relentless and they're exciting and they're big energy and they're fun to watch. Your Seven, your The Game. Panic Room, I think, is a great example of that. I would even say his Lisbeth Salander Dragon Tattoo movie sort of falls to that. And then there's also these like really sort of heady, kind of thinky, social commentary kind of movies. And I would put, obviously it's been weighted down now by decades of discourse. And so I don't think we need to get into all that. But I would think Fight Club sort of fits in there. And then Social Network and something like this, where they're complicated and they're difficult. Gone Girl too. They're complicated. They're difficult. They're these layered movies, and he's not getting at anything that's a simple, straightforward, easy to get your hand around kind of idea. I think with a lot of these movies, he's chasing something that's a little bit more abstract. So I don't know if that's where I'd start people. That's like a long way around to saying, I feel like the way to get people in would be like The Game. Like that's a perfect first one, or Panic Room. Like it's very accessible. It's very immediate. Everybody is like, oh, here's what I like about this movie. And then, once you're through those, maybe build yourself up to a Social Network or a Zodiac. I'm not a huge Benjamin Button fan. I know some people love that one. That's always been the one of his that kind of loses me. I don't know.
Yeah, that's another one that I haven't seen, but I haven't put on my list yet because I don't know if I really want to watch it.
It's so much about the effects and the way that they de-age and manipulate Brad Pitt's performance, and I don't know. I guess it doesn't work as well on me, but maybe I should revisit it.
I mean, you had mentioned kind of like some of the problem with Fight Club. I mean, I love Fight Club. I read the book in high school before I saw the movie. And I mean, I was a big, I was a rebel and I was a big Chuck Palahniuk fan in high school.
Sure.
Why not? All my friends in theater were reading the book. So I was like, ooh, I'll read them too. So, so I was also a big Taking Back Sunday fan. So you get Taking Back Sunday on the soundtrack and it's the Chuck Palahniuk book and Brad Pitt. I was in 100% when that was.
Sure. I mean, it's so weird. Like when that first came out, I feel like critics just missed it. And I was like doing, I did the junket for that. I was writing for the UCLA newspaper at that point. And I saw that movie at advanced screenings. It was like, oh, this is super fun. And this is really interesting. And I was surrounded by like these older critics who kind of like didn't get it. Making air quotes. And we're like, oh, it's just, they like thinking that the movie is on Tyler Durden's side, which is kind of this really reductive way to sort of go about it. But it's almost gone now like the opposite direction. And like it got overpraised now to the point that I think we're all kind of sick of hearing about it, and it just feels like a movie we've talked to death, and there's nothing left that's interesting meat to pick off those bones in a weird way. So it's weird to see the movie go from like each opposite end, like kind of people underthinking it and not quite getting it, to now people like way overthinking it, and probably like we're kind of done with that one and ready for the next movie.
Oh, for sure. And then like I tell people, like, if you just literally date, I feel like knowing now how he was with making Zodiac and how much it literally to the T that movie follows the novel with it for pretty much the most part. It's like when you have that much attention to detail, I think that was where a lot of my big appreciation came from, because I like to read the books and then see the movie, and then I'll also do the whole, well, it didn't really follow it, or if it's like way off the rails, I'm like, well, you should have just made a whole different, shouldn't even said it was based off someone else's work. So I really do think that knowing that now and knowing how he did with Zodiac, having that attention to detail is just so cool. It makes me appreciate his work even more.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's interesting because it's both the movies, I think, reflect that there's this incredibly patient, careful, thoughtful guy at the helm, but they're also so much about that. They're about people who can't stop and who are just like these nebbishy obsessives who get lost in their work. Like, he's so kind of aware of that side of him and bakes it into the stories a lot of the time. So it's sort of, this interesting, like, where does the movie end and the obsessiveness begin? And I mean, Zodiac is the perfect movie to sort of talk about that with, because it's a study in obsession. Every scene is the characters having to make a decision about where my priorities lie. And every time they're like, well, I got to figure out what's going on in this case. And I love that he doesn't psychoanalyze it too much. It's just like, that's how it is. And this is life. You're constantly drawn into these decisions about where your priorities are. And this is what those guys chose.
Yeah. And when you see how Paul Avery becomes first one that's super obsessed and following, and Jake Gyllenhaal is just there and he's kind of helping and he's still interested in it. And then once Paul Avery's now done and out of the picture and he's gone, how Jake Gyllenhaal kind of just picks up the torch and then really runs with it. We're to the point where like he's getting his kids involved. And like wild.
But it's also fascinating to see how Fincher frames all of these scenes that we come to understand. I think by the time Gyllenhaal takes over, because it's kind of in phases. It's sort of Downey Jr.'s leading the investigation at first, then Ruffalo kind of takes over, and then finally Gyllenhaal finishes it off. And I think you can always see that it is in some ways about these guys wanting to be at the center of where things are happening, and these guys wanting to be the focal point of the attention, and these guys wanting to be in the room where it happens, as Hamilton would sort of later say. And you can, like, in the early scenes in the newsroom, you've always got Downey Jr.'s in the center of the frame, and all the journalists are collected around him, and they're talking about, and Gyllenhaal is floating around. He wants to be part of it, but he's not in the group. And there's even all this, Grace Smith, don't you have a cartoon to go finish? Get out of here. And then in that second part, you've got, Ruffalo, where he's challenging all these other guys and these other jurisdictions, and he's constantly, sort of like having to force himself, like, no, what about this? We need this file, we need that. And you need and he's like the movie cop who's always in the shadow of Steve McQueen, Clint Eastwood, all these guys who are playing these larger than life versions of him. And then finally, in the end, you get, Gyllenhaal, and it's kind of the same thing. People keep sort of pushing him away. He wants to keep being in the center. And then you get that brilliant sequence with Charles Fleischer, where he goes to Bob Vaughn's house and he goes into the basement. And finally, we get to that point where, like, he gets too close to the center, and it's terrifying. And it's like, what am I doing here? Why did I want to go this deep?
Yes. And oh my God, when he's trying to open the door and he's like, just like with how you see just even with the walking fast, runs up the stairs, grabs his bag, trying to get out the door. That was incredible. And then even one of those toward our final shot with Gyllenhaal, that's gets him where he goes into the hardware store and sees Lee, and they just sit there and just stare at each other. And Lee realizes what he's here to look at him at, and the way that on the edge of my seat, holding my breath, like, is someone gonna say anything? What's gonna happen?
Right,
and then it's done.
but he denies you that moment. Nobody says anything, and you never really get that sense. They're exchanging these looks, and they're meaningful looks, but at the same time, they're very ambiguous. And I mean, to go back to the Bob Vaughn scene again, by the time you get to the end of the movie's theory is that he had nothing to do with the Zodiac. Mm-hmm. Neither did his friend Rick Marshall. This was a dead end, theoretically. And yet, so what's the explanation? Like, so going back, is Bob Vaughn just messing with this guy? Is he being creepy on purpose? Does he not realize that he's creeping this guy out until the end? Like, and we just let it sit there. Because any other movie, that scene would be your giveaway that this is the killer.
Right.
Like, he's had this realization that that's not Rick Marshall's handwriting on that poster. It's mine. And that would be the reveal in any other movie. But in this movie, everything is a reveal and nothing is a reveal. You'll never get to the bottom of it. Not everything can ever be explained. So Bob Vaughn's just a creep. We don't know why. He's just a creep he's got the one basement in California.
Yeah. Real creep.
Yeah. I love that. As long as I'm remembering it. There's a part late at night, Ruffalo calls Anthony Edwards and he's like, hey, I just realized not a lot of houses in California have basements.
Yeah.
And Anthony Edwards, he doesn't have to look anything up. He's got the letters memorized because he immediately recalls the exact quote. Oh, right. He says basement for future use. And just that, where by this point, these guys know every word the Zodiac killer has ever written them. It's all in here. They're living this 24 hours a day. And it's just like a really subtle little moment to kind of remind you of that.
Oh, for sure. And also, I really kind of talking about Ruffalo and Edwards and the whole detectives for the entire film. Watching them struggle with the coordination and between the different counties and everything. And that's why back in the 70s and 80s, when you had like the Green River Killer and Ted Bundy and all these serial killers, one of the biggest reasons they were able to get away with it for as long as they were, or at least in some cases like the Zodiac still gotten away with it, was because they were in different counties. The technology wasn't there to coordinate. Everyone wants to be the glory hound to find the serial killer because it's sensational news. It's what's going on the 5 and 6 and 9 o'clock news every single night. So how he did that and watching that and knowing that that's probably just how frustrating as it was in real life was incredible, impeccable.
Yeah. And I mean, right. Like so much of this is, it's not just about the investigation in terms of here's what the brilliant detectives do. It's about all the parts that have to come together to make an investigation like this happen. Like you've got to deal with the handwriting experts, and this handwriting expert disagrees with that handwriting expert. And you've got to figure out, this DA doesn't want us to do the search, but if we can find him in this county and work with this DA, and it really it's not afraid of digging into the details. And that's so refreshing because so many movies are terrified of details and want to keep everything, keep it moving. Don't get bogged down. That's always, when you're writing a script, especially, that's always the mantra of just like every scene has to have action and it's got to be motivated and you got to keep moving. And this movie is like, I mean, it doesn't feel slowly paced, but it takes the time out to be like, you know what? We need a scene explaining, well, here's what happened in Napa, and here's why in Napa they didn't figure this out, but they did figure out in Vallejo, and like here's how they came together. And here's the difficulty personality conflict with the Riverside sheriff, and why that was important. And I just like you get so much packed into this one. It's a long movie, but there's so much packed in, enough for 4 movies.
I mean, and the emotion from the other detectives towards Tashi when Avery goes on and does his announcement about connecting this Riverside murder to the Zodiac, where even the cops in Riverside said, we don't think it's connected. But Avery had the audacity to go ahead and just do it. And then I love when he shows up to talk to them and he was like, look, I did you a favor. Like I gave it to you. And Mark was like, no, you didn't. You've literally gotten in my way and screwed so much up that you don't even realize.
Yeah, and right, and how much it becomes this sort of like team sport where everybody has their theory. Like when Gyllenhaal, that's the other thing, you mentioned this up top. Everybody in this movie is like a person who was either famous or went on to become famous. So there's a scene where Gyllenhaal goes to see the sister of one of the victims who's an inmate in prison, and it's just Clea Duvall.
Yeah.
In one scene, she just shows up. And he's asking her, at first he's asking her, there was this creepy guy at the party who your sister knew, and what was his name? And she's like, oh, it was a short name. And he's like, it was Rick. Because he thinks at that point, he's on team Rick Marshall. That Rick Marshall did it. I'm convinced. Now I just have to prove it. And she's like, no, it wasn't. And he's like yelling at his own witness, like, no, think about it. It was Rick. And it's like, that's how this becomes. It really is like everybody who was working on the case became like that. And they all had their favorite, like Donald Logue, too, who's the I believe he's the chief of police of Napa.
Yes.
When Gyllenhaal goes to see him and asks about Rick Marshall, he gets this little smile and he's like, well, you just named my favorite person in the whole case. They are all, they have a side that they want to win in a weird way, because it's gone on so long and it has become, competitive for these guys in a way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because you said it, and with Tashi and Armstrong, it was all about Lee, and that's who they kept trying to push, even though the handwriting, that was, again, those little details, the handwriting doesn't match. So they're like, well, he's ambidextrous, get it for the left hand. Well, the DA doesn't want to we have to have a search warrant for who would have thought you would have to have a search warrant for someone to write with their other hand? I mean, it makes sense, but it's not, I never would have thought about that. That's why I'm not a cop.
Right, and again, like Philip Baker Hall playing the handwriting analysis expert. Yeah, the great. And it just keeps going on, and you sort of follow this journey, and it's an emotional journey for these guys, even though it's not what we would normally think of. You get some scenes. There are like Chloe Sevigny plays Gyllenhaal's wife, and June Diane Raphael, the great How Did This Get Made podcast.
I love that podcast so much.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And so there are those like the I call them the Donnie Brasco. Have you seen Donnie Brasco?
Yes, I have seen Donnie Brasco. So
there's those. I love Donnie Brasco, but there's those really annoying scenes that they gave poor Anne Heche, where they're really repetitive, and there's like 5 of them where he's like, he goes home and she's like, why are you missing your kids growing up? Why are you always leaving the house so much? And it's like that really generic, like the cop works too hard and the wife is tired of not having him home. And I like that you get that around the edges of this one, but we don't spend a ton of time in that world.
No, for sure.
Just enough to kind of get it, but we don't hit that trope too hard over the head.
No, and because it's with like Gyllenhaal and Melanie, it's her name. But when they first start on their first date, she goes back home and they're waiting for this phone call, and she's like super into all of it because it's a really interesting date. It's what we're doing. And then they get married and they have kids together. And she's like, I need you to not do this because we know that he stalks the people who are publishing and talking about him. And it becomes a whole different kind of ball game in the sense of it's now a safety thing. It's not you're not here. You're now putting our children in danger, and that's not cool.
And I love that in most movies that would be the emotional arc of the movie. It's like he's got to make this decision about whether his priority is the family or whatever. And in this movie, the emotional journey is his connection to the case and his obsession with the Zodiac and really his relationship with Arthur Lee Allen, and all of that stuff fades into the background. And I think we get the message without having to be hit over the head. It's kind of the same bit that Scorsese does in The Irishman, where a lot of people were, when that movie came out, they were like, oh, Anna Paquin, why would she even be in this? She gets such the short shrift. She's always in the background. He barely gets any dialogue. And it's like, well, yeah, that's the point that he's making, is that this guy's whole life, he ignored his daughter because he was so focused on what was going on with the union or what was going on with Hoffa or what was going on with the crime family. And it's like, I feel like it's the same thing here. Like we get these little blips and bloops of Gyllenhaal's home life in the background, or, like Tashi's wife being like, what's going on? But they're not the focus. Like the emotional arc is their disappointment at not catching the Zodiac because it's their job, or because it's who they're supposed to be in their heads, or it's because they have something to prove, I think that's really the kind of fascinating subtext under every scene.
Oh, for sure. I love the scene where after Tashi somehow becomes a suspect in writing a fake letter, or when June Diane Raphael's on the phone talking to Gyllenhaal and he just wants to talk to him, and she's just like, you cost him this, and Mark Ruffalo just walks over, takes the phone from her and just hangs it up, and he's like, we're good, it's done, leave it. And
Well,
Okay.
I think that's such a fascinating. I mean, I think that's another thing that's so fascinating about this movie, and so I think it's so bold to leave
Mm-hmm.
that there. Is that we've been following Mark Ruffalo? He's one of our main characters. He's one of the heroes of the movie,
Mm-hmm.
and at no point when we're watching him do we get the idea that this guy is a showboat. This guy loves the spotlight. He sees himself as like Hollywood. Other people talk about it like, oh,
Right.
McQueen got the where to hold the gun under his armpit. He got that from Tashi. And then he goes to see Dirty Harry, and people are like, hey, Clint did a great job with your case. But we never get the sense from watching him that he's
Right.
caught up in that. But then we hear that story third hand that Armistead Maupin, who wrote Tales from the City, that very famous sort of ongoing narrative column about people in San Francisco, that he had been secretly like sock puppeting, writing letters, encouraging this author to write more about the fictional character based on it because he liked being in the newspaper and he liked being famous. And that's not a very flattering thing to find out about your hero. And then never have it brought up. Nobody ever brings it up.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't deny it. There's no scene where he's embarrassed. He has to confess or he has to deal with it. We always get that scene in movies. They feel like you're not telling the story unless you show us
Right.
the character grappling with this stuff. And Fincher just kind of leaves it there and lets you think about, well, how much of that is connected to his desire to catch Zodiac? Like, how much of it is that he wants to be the guy? Like,
Right.
he wants to be the great detective that cracked the case, and all these doofuses in farm towns couldn't figure it out. They needed David Tashi,
Yeah, and even for leading up to that moment is you're watching, and while you have everyone being the glory hound with it, it felt like, at least for me watching it, that Tashi just wanted to solve it because it's his job and it's
Right.
getting a killer off the street, and he is that by the book detective and trying to figure it out to not have the glory, and then to have that moment where fuck, like maybe it was,
Right.
and to have the kind of like that wool pull over your eyes.
And they all have that, I think, because Avery too, like we assume right away that it's, well, he wants to be the hero. He wants to be the guy who caught Zodiac and with the gun, and oh, he's sending me letters now. But there is also a sense that it breaks him to not figure it out. Like he really thought of himself as the smarter guy, this idiot who can't even spell his letters correctly. Like I'm gonna outwit this maniac, and then he can, and it breaks him, and he ends up, living in this hovel in a houseboat in Sacramento.
Right.
And I think, Graysmith too, there's that element of, well, he's tired of being the cartoonist that nobody respected and wanted in the room. And he wants to prove that he's not just a guy who's good at puzzles and knows how to get to the library. He's the equal of all these other people that look right past him. And I just love how all of this stuff is in there, but none of it is like, that's the answer. It's all just kind of there, and the movie lets you determine for yourself what the answer is, or if there's an answer.
And just pretty much like how the Zodiac case itself is just hanging there, and you can make your conclusions, and Lee being the one that a lot of people are pointing the finger to, saying it had to be him, and they tried to bring him in for one last kind of questioning, and he ends up dying of a heart attack, so we'll never know.
You got to say that John Carroll Lynch performance as Arthur Lee Allen is absolutely spectacular.
It's incredible.
He gives you nothing. He's incredibly creepy. It's very sinister, but he doesn't ever betray like, oh, this guy did it. He's lying. Like there's always, it could just be that this guy is just a huge creep. Like,
right.
He never totally lets you off the hook of maybe this guy is just really like dark and weird.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Going back to the scene that we talked about when Jake Gyllenhaal goes and just kind of confronts him and stares at him. Yeah. And like Arthur Lee Allen has no idea why Jake Gyllenhaal is there, or maybe he does. We don't know. We're never gonna know.
Right.
But
I mean, if he is the Zodiac, he knows who Robert Graysmith is because he's been calling, theoretically, been calling his house.
Right.
But maybe he doesn't know what Robert Graysmith looks like.
Right.
Maybe he just knows the name.
Yeah. Or, if it's not him, and now this man is just coming into the store where I work
just
and
staring him down
after knowing his history, like, what is he here for? Because really, the guy fits the bill for a potential serial killer when you kind of play it out the way like the media would or a detective would be to try to figure it out with.
Well, and there's obviously something wrong with it. But we've seen how he lives in this trailer with these squirrels everywhere, and like not a normal guy, but that's not
squirrels.
illegal either.
The
squirrels thing is very chilling. And
that was. I mean, I've seen rats, you've seen snakes. I think that was the first one I've seen like squirrels.
It's also there's something very sinister about a squirrel in a cage. Like, why would there be a squirrel in a cage?
Well, other squirrels are just running rampant.
Why would you need to keep a squirrel for later? It's just like there's something very unsettling about that entire sort of sequence.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, it still gives me like just like I feel it like in the back of my throat, like just.
I believe the real story. I'm looking it up. I'm fascinated. I believe they. I don't think they found live squirrels.
Gotcha.
The dead squirrels in the freezer bit is true.
Okay.
But there were maybe not live squirrels running around. That's a Fincher.
That's a Fincher add-on. We'll allow it.
Intense. Well, it's also. I feel like it gives you this. It gives you like a ticking clock, even though there is no ticking clock. Like they don't have to clear out within a certain amount of time, but it makes it so uncomfortable to be in that setting that we're like eager to get out of there. And I think it lends the scene that, which is a common theme in this film.
For sure. The other thing that kind of surprises me about this movie, just because I think it's absolutely brilliantly done, especially obviously the direction, but the writing of it is incredible. But it wasn't nominated for any major award, no Oscars, nothing. I mean, it won something in like the Dublin Film Festival, but that's it.
I think that's I think it's partly what we've been praising, which is the lack of it's not showy. It's the case file, but it doesn't feel like a dramatization of the case file. And I think there's a version of this story that could have been more of an Oscar contender if you gave these guys some speeches and you had them explore the psychology of what they were going through more, or especially the relationships. I mean, if more of the movie was about the dissolution of Gyllenhaal's marriage, or what was going on with Toschi's personal life and these accusations and how that ruined him, or what was driving Paul Avery to descend into alcoholism. Because we really we know very little about these guys outside of the context of these investigations. And I think that version of the movie would have been the more conventional version and probably would have appealed to Oscar voters more. And the version that we got is this much more kind of heady, weird, almost like in a weird way, because this was 2007, kind of predicting the true crime movement, because this is almost like a true crime podcast before Serial existed. Like this was almost like the proto version of that,
where you end up binging 12 episodes just to find out there's no answer. It's like become like my new favorite thing. It's like
in the same way that like we're not getting too sucked into like Adnan's personal life because we've got to here's the next piece of evidence and we're following the trail as opposed to the human story.
And then when you go back and re-listen to it after you know that nothing changed and you're just like, oh, they just pretty much resaid what they said in episode 2 and episode 6, but added this and a little bit of extra drama to it. And it's like, this is dumb. It was like, we just recently finished the second season of a podcast called To Live and Die in LA. And the first season was insane with the things that they found out and what they did. I mean, and then you get into the second season, and again, the ending of it was just like, well, there's no real big break in the case.
Yeah, I think it inevitably with these podcasts, there's a little bit of, and some of them have managed to keep it up, but there's definitely a little bit of like, it's sort of, how many times are you going to find like the most amazing, crazy, twisty murder case? Like most murder cases are not like that. They're very straightforward. Right. And I think there's a thirst for true crime that at this point exceeds the amount of incredibly crazy, twisty murder cases. So you get a lot of these movies and podcasts and shows that they're trying to make a lot out of not very much. There's a Hulu 3-parter called Sasquatch.
Okay.
It's about in the 70s, there were a few it's very convoluted. Okay. A guy in the 70s heard an anecdote from another guy about a group of people who were murdered by a Bigfoot.
Okay.
in Northern California pot growing country, in like Humboldt County, up in the woods, where they, at that point, obviously weed was still illegal nationwide. So a lot of the illegal cannabis crop for America was being grown in Humboldt County, California. And that's where this guy was working. And he said he heard this story. And so now, present day, he goes back up to Humboldt County to investigate. Did anybody else ever hear about this story? Was there a triple homicide that maybe this could have been? And I mean, a great tantalizing setup for a true crime show. But what really happens is not much. Like, he can't really ever find anything definitive. Obviously, listen, spoiler alert, folks. He does not find proof of Bigfoot. So
damn it.
It just winds up, you get 3 episodes deep, and there are interesting detours. You get a little bit of the history of like cannabis industry and pot growing in Northern California at the time, and who was working on these farms and how are they getting there and all that stuff. So that stuff is interesting, but you might as well have just made the show about that, because there really isn't that much. And I feel like we get a lot of that these days, where there's such a desire to make everything into a Zodiac type story. But how many criminals out there are really like this? Very few. Most of them give themselves away right away and don't evade justice for decades.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The only podcast that I want to say like gave me the best payoff that was a true crime like story for an unsolved case is I don't know if you've ever listened. It's called Up and Vanished, and they were following the Tara Grinstead disappearance back in late 90s, early 2000s from like a small town in Georgia. And halfway through the season, like airing and coming out, he had to take a 3-week break because they actually caught the guys because of that podcast and people talking and people coming forward. And they just put them, one of them ended up doing like a guilty or non-guilty plea or something. And then they just did another trial for one of those people. But none of that would have happened without this guy going out and stirring it up and trying to figure it out. So it's the one and only one where I think something's ever been solved.
And that's an amazing lightning strike moment, but it's just, man, it's really hard to just consistently keep finding those stories and doing that over and over again. And even when you could find, unsolved mystery stories, a lot of the time they're just not narratively satisfying in that way. It's just like, well, could have been these guys, could have been that guy.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. And I also think so many of the stories come back to, it's really the same story, which is brutal incompetence or corruption. The cops didn't care, or the cops did a bad job, or the cops got confused. And it's like you got 90% of these are just that. And so it's like, well, that I don't want to keep hearing that over and over again. It's depressing.
For sure, 100%. It's like you're playing a slot machine, and every single, which is what I as a behavior analyst for a living, I understand how these little reinforcers kind of work. So you get one podcast that solves the mystery. So you're like, okay, this next one, I bet they're going to do it. They sound so confident. And then you get to the end, you're like, fuck, no, they didn't.
Yeah. Well, it's like Capturing the Freedmans, that documentary?
No.
So Capturing the Freedmans, the documentary filmmaker, he was going to make a film about birthday party clowns. That was the setup. He was in the New York area, and he was going to follow a bunch of different professional guys who worked at birthday parties as clowns. And he was following this one father-daughter or father-son duo that would work birthday parties as clowns. And what he did not realize when he first started making the film was that there was a crazy true crime story involving this father-son duo that involved pedophilia and human trafficking and really dark, twisted shit that he only got a perspective on and found out about because he was filming these guys for this totally unconnected documentary about party clowns.
That's crazy.
That's going to happen, but 1 out of every 10 billion times somebody starts a documentary. I don't want to use the word lucky, because obviously it's a horrific. I highly recommend the documentary. It's fascinating, but it is horrific.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm on
it. It's not a lucky thing that happened, but it's this would, what a moonshot coincidence to stumble into a story like that. And you can't count on that.
Or on the opposite hand, where someone got charged with murder and then years later an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm is playing and you see the guy eating a
Yes.
hot dog at the baseball game when said murder was happening. And like, that's how he was able to go free. It's incredible. Well, so before we start wrapping things up, what I like to do at the end of every show is I go into Letterboxd. Maybe they'll sponsor me one day. Give me some money. I don't know. We'll see.
Where you at,
But why
Letterboxd?
not? We put it out there. And I, say I watch the film and then I rate it. I will probably say the only thing that's going to keep me from a full 5 stars is length. When movies hit almost 3 hours for me, it's not a bad thing because it doesn't feel like 3 hours on that first immediate watch. But I know for a fact that I'm probably not going to watch it again in the near future because I have to sit down and watch the whole thing. I can't do a stop and start.
I mean, this is, to be fair, this is one of those long movies that, like, if you catch it at any point, you get sucked in, and before you know it, you're watching it the whole way. So I do have a lot of hesitance sometimes about long movies, but this is one that I forget is as long as it is.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have that. It doesn't have that. And I love the Lord of the Rings movies, but it doesn't have that Lord of the Rings-ness where it feels like, here we go, strap in, whole day on the couch.
Oh, we'll have to talk about my Lord of the Rings feelings another day, another time.
Yeah.
But even with that being said, I'm going ahead and saying 4.5 stars. I think it was just brilliantly done. It's from the dialogue to the direction to just everything about it. The story being told. We haven't
mentioned the needle drops too. He's so good at picking songs that evoke the time period, but that. So often it's like, well, what was the number one song in America in this moment? Let's pick that song. And, so we'll play that so everybody will know when it is because, well, the Bee Gees. And he doesn't do that. He finds these like deeper cuts or less used, less popular songs, but they still have that. They all evoke the era. And Donovan's Hurdy-Gurdy Man, which opens and closes the movie, is so creepy. Like when you put it in this context, it's such an unsettling song. And it's not the original song is just like about a guy who meets like a mystic. It's got the sort of, I think Donovan wrote it with the Beatles while he was in India. But it takes on such a creepy note in this movie. It just sounds really unsettling. Yeah.
I do. I literally, I mean, I've said it once, I'll say it a million times. I'm a sucker for a good score. I'm a sucker for a good soundtrack. And you really can make or break a movie based off of those two things. And I think it's so important for I was a big fan of last year, Belfast, when that came out, because I'm a huge Van Morrison fan. So the fact that the entire soundtrack was Van Morrison and knowing the history behind Northern Ireland and what was going on at the time, it just was absolutely perfect. It's now going to be one of my, or you look at a movie like Sing Street and the incredible original music and songs that were put into it. So the everything about music wise in this movie it's
so good. And he brings you into these settings with the song. There's a real quick, and again, it's like the police blotter bit of this, where you cut very quickly to the school teachers who solved the first Zodiac cipher, just sitting down in their breakfast nook, like, well, what do you think, honey? You want to give this one a try? And they're listening to that Johnny Mathis song. Yeah. What is it? It's not for me to say. Yeah. And it just brings you immediately into these people's lives. Like, oh, I know who this couple is. Yeah. I get who these people are. I'm in their home right now. And it's like that stuff is just like, I don't know. It's just, he's got a gift.
He does.
Like to come up with what the song would be for that scenario that's so perfect is like, how do you do it?
Oh man, I can't wait for my next foray into Fincher, because I got a bunch I still need to
Have you
get
seen Panic Room? That's
is that the one that I've Jodie?
That's Jodie.
Oh yeah, that one I have seen. It's been a long time though. I saw that when that first came out.
I think that this is my favorite. I think that one is his most underrated. Where I think that one people just take for granted that he's just like a master stylist who can just like knock out like a Hitchcock riff. Yeah. Like it's nothing. But it's not nothing. It's really hard to put a thriller together that's like that tight. So I really like that.
That one's really good. I remember just like, he's really good with like the way that he does certain things. Like there's certain moments in each of his films that I remember that I've seen to a T. So like Panic Room, when the guy gets his hand crushed in the door, like that immediately hits my head. Yeah. Fight Club, but you're fucking Marla. And, well, technically, you're fucking Marla. Like, right there's another one that, like, so those kind of moments. And then, you know, everything we've kind of talked about with the Zodiac is going to be just like living rent, or, you know, 7, what's in the box, you know?
Right.
So, awesome. Well, Lon, I really appreciate you joining me today. Before we get out of here, where can people find you?
Oh, just find me on Twitter at LONS. That's the best place to look for me. I post everything I'm sort of working on over there. But also check out my podcast with Hal Rudnick, Binge Boys. We just watch stuff on streaming every week, and then we talk about it. Much like this, but with, you know, whatever we happen to watch that week. Ted Lasso or whatever.
Oh, I love Ted Lasso. So sad it's getting a final season.
Who does?
And if you all are listening and enjoying what you're hearing, please make sure to subscribe, rate, and review Flick and Reel on whatever audio platform you're listening to us on. If you're listening on YouTube, please make sure you subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts on Zodiac or any of the other previous films we've discussed. Make sure you hit the little bell notifications for any time we have new content drop. And you can follow the show on Twitter at NeverSeenItFNR. And you can follow me, Allison Salamone, on Twitter as well at Allison Salamone. And until next time, my friends, be safe and let's go watch more movies.